Okay, welcome. There you go. I can't do that. I've never been able to do that. Well, we're glad to have everybody here this afternoon. Thank you for being present. I understand we're competing with member guest golf tournament and who knows what else, but I am really grateful for those of you who are here and for those who are also watching online. What's that, Paige? What is that noise? I don't think it must be. It's probably that. It's probably the microphone is picking up the fan, which essentially up there it doesn't do that. It was mentioned to me earlier that sometimes you have a harder time seeing me if I'm on your level than if I'm up there. Where you want me to be, I don't care. Well, in that case, I'll just stay down here. Yeah, that worked. Thank you, Jerry. That's great. Anyway, I'm really glad to see those of you in the room, those of you online, and share with your friends what we're doing for 4 Thursdays so that they can come pick up the next 3. And if you have friends who are out of town, or you have to be out of town, know that you can live stream it and be a part of the Bible study by doing that. Catherine, you have our new directories, right? So if anybody has not yet picked up a directory, you can see Catherine Petrie after this is over, and she has them with her. So thank you. Is there anything else we need to share or say? Okay. And let me remind you that Sunday we have a guest. It's the only time this summer, but you're going to love him. Mark King, absolutely delightful, wonderful preacher, a nut, and a gifted, deeply devoted person. So you're really going to like Mark, those of you who don't know him yet. That's Sunday morning. Okay, let's begin with a prayer. God, we are grateful for every opportunity to join together as your children, part of your family in this, your house. We pray today that you will open up to us your word, that it may become our own, and through us, that it may reach out to the world. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, just sort of set the table, and then we'll move forward. What we're going to do for 4 weeks is to take a look at Paul's letters to the Corinthians to the extent that we have them. We know that he wrote more to them than we actually have, but we're going to look at what we do have and also then at Paul's letter to the Philippians. And we'll compare, contrast, and take a look at not only the communities to which the letters were written and the issues within the communities and the statements of faith, but also some of the evolution of Paul himself, which to me is a fascinating thing. The reason I chose these 2 books is because Corinthians is written fairly early in his ministry. It's not the first letter that we have in our possession. That would be 1 Thessalonians, but it's written fairly early. It's when Paul is sort of at the top of his game. He's strong. He's visionary. He assumes that this movement is going to take over the world and that he's going to be one of the ones leading the charge. And he is filled with that kind of energy. Philippians is the last letter that we have from him. And it's written from prison, where Paul is increasingly aware that he's probably going to die under the reign of Nero. So there's a different tone to his writing from when he's out, free, moving about, in charge, headstrong, to where he's confined, vulnerable, and contemplating the end. We'll see, we'll probably do this on the very last day together when we begin to compare and contrast. We're going to take a look today and next week at Corinthians, the next week at Philippians, and then we're going to compare and contrast and look at Paul. But we'll see how Paul's thoughts evolved very naturally. And you know, if you read something in the Bible and then you read something that feels different from that, we sometimes have a problem. We think, you know, this is God's word and it's true, and yet these things they seem to be in conflict. What do I do with them? What am I missing? Really, I'm missing much of anything. This reflects and reveals the humanity of the writer and the specific situations. If you were to find a copy of a love letter that you wrote to somebody when you were a sophomore in college, and you had dated them 4 times, and the whole universe suddenly revolved around that person, and you were filled with dreams and passion and romance, and you wrote a love letter to that person, it would be authentically your writing, and it would be authentically about the topic of love. If you read that over against the love letter that you wrote to your spouse on the occasion of your 50th anniversary, it would be a very different document, but each one would be written by you. They would be honest, and they would be about love, but they would reflect the journey you had made across those years. So when we read things that don't seem quite to connect or quite consistent, or they seem like they are at odds with one another, what we need to remember is we're reading from early in Paul's life to the very end of Paul's life. Also, we've said this before, sermons, Bible study last year, every text to be properly understood has to be read in context. Corinth and Philippi are so profoundly different in many, many ways that what you would write to one would be pointless to another, and vice versa. So when Paul is writing these letters, Paul was not thinking, what does the whole world need in 2019? Paul was thinking, what does this church in Corinth need right now? And what does this church in Philippi need right now? When he wrote Corinthians, he didn't think there would be a 2019. He thought the second coming was going to occur at any time. He was writing to specific churches in a specific setting for specific reasons at a specific time. And what we do is to take those messages and look for themes that are consistent and timeless. And that's how a timely word speaks in a timeless way across the centuries to us. So all I'm saying is, don't get nervous if what Paul says to the Corinthians at one point, and maybe what he says to the Philippians, doesn't seem quite the same. There are reasons for that. He didn't write generic letters. He wrote specific letters to particular people in concrete moments in time and situations. And their situations in Philippi and Corinth were very different. So let's get started today with 1 Corinthians. I've got notes for 1st and 2nd, but we won't get to 2nd. Or if we do, then I have no idea what I'll do on our 4th Thursday together. Paul was in Corinth probably about 50 or 51 AD or CE, whatever your pleasure is on that one. And we get that from the book of Acts. If you're in the 18th chapter, there's a long passage, but look about verse 9. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent." Paul had been given reason to think that he was going to be consistently opposed. When he arrived in Corinth, he was opposed, same as in Philippi, same as in almost everywhere. And he thought that he was going to be seriously opposed. And fresh in his mind is what happened in Ephesus when they tried to kill him for his preaching. He had to be sneaked out of town. So understandably, Paul is a little nervous, even though it's Paul, when he gets there and begins to preach and suddenly gets a lot of opposition. So he pulls back and he's practicing tent making, which was his profession. And we read, "The Lord said, 'Do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent. For I'm with you, and no one shall attack you to harm you as they had elsewhere. For I have many people in this city.'" In other words, you're not alone on this one. You have troops. You have spiritual troops, and they're going to surround you and if need be, insulate and protect you. And he stayed 1 year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them. Now we know what happened as a result of that is that a group of people formed a believing community. There were some Jews in the city of Corinth, and they were, many of them, very open because Paul was Jewish himself and was talking about that which they had anticipated and dreamed about and prayed for forever, which was the arrival of the Messiah. So he began to talk to them in the synagogues, one of their own people, about their own prophecies and their own dreams. Nothing offensive about that. The line that was crossed for some of them was when he said, "And oh, by the way, that Messiah for whom you have waited all these years has arrived and lived and taught and died and was resurrected." At that point, he gets resistance from some who simply did not believe and didn't want to believe and found that it would not be profitable for them to believe. Others said, "Wonderful, hallelujah, this is great. You're telling us that what we waited for all these years has happened? Thank goodness." So they migrated into this new community, assuming that it was a Jewish community that was celebrating what they'd waited for forever. But there were other faith communities in Corinth. There were Roman temples to Roman gods, not as many as in Philippi. That was the big deal there. But there were Roman temples to Roman gods. And the Roman gods were gods of the state as much as anything else. You know, the Caesar was worshipped. And those people listened, some of them, when Paul said, "Even the Caesars who have ruled over you, when they died, they stay dead. But this Jesus was raised from the dead. And here are his teachings. And here's some, and we'll talk about this later, some of the validation of the resurrection. Show me a Caesar who can match that." So some of the people that went to the Roman temple said, "You're right. And these teachings sound legitimate and spiritually strong and healthy. And what you're saying about this man Jesus who came back from the dead is convincing, and we're going to go over to that place and start listening to more." Because church at that point was a teaching fellowship, as opposed to, which we should still be, but we are a variety of things. But then it was a teaching fellowship because it was all new. Then there were Greek temples, and those who went to the Greek temples were theological by disposition. The Greeks, it was up here. They loved to think and debate and discuss and ask questions and wrestle with issues and ideas. And so a new guy coming along and saying, "Let me talk to you about how God might be understood and even revealed. And let's see if you can be convinced." And they love to go to that mat. See if you can convince me. Let's see what happens on that one. But they did that with a kind of, not resistance, but an invitation. Okay, take your best shot. Let me see what you've got to offer. And what Paul had to offer was significant enough that a number of people... So you have people coming into this new church from a variety of sources. Some from synagogues, some from Roman temples, and some from Greek temples, primarily the temple of Aphrodite. Corinth was a very wealthy, very powerful port city. And so it had well-educated, it had the whole gamut. But a lot of well-educated people, a lot of people with financial abilities, and therefore a lot of people who could be very, very profitable to the Christian movement, because Paul was really concerned with keeping the church in Jerusalem alive, and it was on the ropes. I don't mean to keep using boxing analogies, but when I don't write a sermon out, this is what happens. God knows what's going to come right out. But the churches in Jerusalem were struggling financially. So he gets to a place like Corinth and he says, well, if I get these people excited about Jesus and excited about the mission, they can finance both our movement into the rest of the Mediterranean world and towards Spain, which he really wanted to do, and they can bail out our brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. So this was a place that got Paul excited. He was excited about preaching faith. He was excited about converting people to Jesus. And he was excited about those people then becoming agents of conversion or of mission throughout the world. So Paul throws himself into a year and a half of establishing this church in this important city with this variety of people coming in, and then he goes on to do his work elsewhere. Goes to Macedonia, which is where Philippi is actually, and he's busy. And after a while, probably about a year or so, he begins to hear that all is not smooth sailing back in Corinth, that there are all kind of things happening that you don't want happening in a church. So 1 Corinthians is his response to that. And you have your sheets, I think, and they show you what the problems are. Divisions, sexual immorality, question about food, which you and I think, why? 3 chapters devoted to dealing with that one because it was a big issue among those people, a spiritual issue. Question where it says the gathering, that's a question basically about worship. But those people, that didn't mean coming to church like you and I do. It meant folks within the family of faith gathering in homes where they did their worship, where they ate their meals, where they built their fellowship, and where they proclaimed the truth of faith. And then they were having issues about resurrection and whether or not it was real. So Paul writes to them this first letter. Paul's not, you know the Bible. He's not like warm and fuzzy, He sort of is to the Philippians and he sort of is to Timothy, but basically there's a curmudgeon side, and he doesn't shy away from a battle. And even next week when we look at 2 Corinthians, which is called the Conciliatory Letter, making up with them, he's nasty enough. So 1 Corinthians is before he does any making up. But anyway, these are the 5 sections: division, sex, food, the gathering, and resurrection. Those are the problems. And he deals with those problems in the 5 sections. Philippians, we'll see later, it's a series of vignettes. So similar. Corinthians are 5 problems, and he deals with them section by section by section. Philippians, a number of vignettes. He deals with them one at a time. But in both, in the middle of it is the truth that he says is the answer to the problems, or is the clarification of the vignettes. And the truth is always Jesus. It's always that. So that's one thing that doesn't change from the start to the finish for Paul. ultimately, the bottom line, it's all about Jesus, about the life, the teaching, the death, the resurrection, the calling, the mission, and the priority of putting Jesus first. Okay, let's take a look. You know, I was reared in Randolph County. I don't know how to talk fast. But you don't listen fast, do you, Bessie? So that works. Mark Depp, who was here, 64, 74. Centenary got him from First Methodist in Pittsburgh. And anybody who may have been here, Mark Depp spoke about 98 miles an hour. And, and everything he said was brilliant. And he was greeting people in the narthex at Centenary one Sunday, relatively early into his ministry. And one of our dear matriarchs came out, who talks like I do. And she said, Dr. Depp, you talk too fast. He said, Madam, you listen too slow. So he never slowed down for anybody. Unfortunately, I have trouble speeding up, but we'll do our best. All right, chapters 1 through 4 are about the divisions. If you look 118 through 216, and I'm going to tell you these things, I hope you'll go home and then actually read what you see on there. So I'll kind of give you a little flavoring, a little prelude, and then you can go home and actually devour it yourselves. But 118 through 216 basically refers to a couple of groups, and we'll come back to these off and on and next week to be sure. There were a couple of groups in Corinth and in other places in Paul's ministry throughout the Greek area who caused problems. One was a group called Gnostics. Gnostics were people who felt that they had divine information, divine insight, that God had told them something that God didn't tell most people. And therefore, it demanded a certain level of respect. You know, if I have special insight or a message from God that you don't have, A, you give me respect, B, it gives me power. And those who sought power in this new church could begin to say, I have been given special revelation. Some of them would be saying, I have been given special revelation that Paul did not, to establish themselves as the ultimate authorities. And that made Paul incredibly unhappy. Another group was called super apostles, and we'll get to them next week. But these were the ones who say, I have experiences. Gnostics say, I have insight. Super apostles say, I have experiences and gifts and abilities that transcend other people's, and therefore I deserve position. So from the very beginning, we see that there's a power struggle in the church. You know, there's a leadership struggle. Who is in charge? And each of them began to align themselves with preachers. So you would say, well, that doesn't sound like that they want to be in charge. It sounds like that they're deferring to some preacher and saying, this guy's in charge. Except that the preachers traveled. They were all itinerant. So those who were left behind full time would have been the Gnostics, the super apostles, the people who had aligned themselves with one of the preachers and would say, therefore, I am the one who will lead this new community. I'll make the decisions, or me and my little group of friends, we're in charge here on behalf of, and they would name a minister. So Paul, you know the old saying, chop off the head, the snake will die. Paul goes and he says, you know, you're pointing toward the head, these different ministers, let's talk about that. All right. The ministers, by the way, were Paul and Apollos, who apparently was a great preacher, and Cephas, or Simon Peter, and these people were aligned. And so Paul says, let's look over chapter 3, where he deals with this directly. All the chapters. I'm still in Acts, that's not going to work. All the chapters 1 through 4 deal with this, but let's go specifically over to 3, beginning with verse 4. And this is, like I said, he's not warm and fuzzy. You were still baby Christians. It was a new community. You and I might say, you're still relatively new in the faith. But far be it from Paul to catch flies with honey. You're still baby Christians, controlled by your own desires, not God's. And then he's surprised in 2 Corinthians that they became upset. When you were jealous of one another and divide up into quarreling groups, doesn't that prove that you're still babies, wanting your own way? In fact, you're acting like people who don't belong to the Lord at all. Quite a call to worship. There you are, quarreling about whether I'm greater than Apollos and dividing the church. Doesn't this show how little you have grown in the Lord? Who am I? Who is Apollos that we should be the cause of a quarrel? And actually, Paul and Apollos had traveled together, and earlier had been a team that went to Corinth. So their alignments made no sense at all. Who am I and who is Apollos that we should be the cause of a quarrel? We're just God's servants, each of us with certain special abilities, and with our help you believed. My work was to plant the seed in your hearts, and Apollos' work was to water it. But it was God, not we, who made the garden grow in your hearts. The person who does the planting or the watering isn't very important, but God is important because he's the one who makes things grow. Apollos and I work together as a team with the same aim, though each of us will be rewarded for his own hard work. We're only God's co-workers. You are God's garden, not ours. You are God's building, not ours. God, in his kindness, has taught me how to be an expert builder. I've laid the foundation. Apollos has built on it. But he who builds on the foundation must be very careful, for no one can ever lay any other real foundation than the one we already have, who is Jesus Christ. Now, earlier in these chapters, he had indicated that there was also, people were bringing Simon Peter in as sort of a second-tier loyalty. So what he says to them here is, your commitment has to be to Jesus. And that's the only thing that this new church is about. And if you can't commit to Jesus, then you're missing the whole point. And he even says to them, you don't even understand what faith is. You don't even belong to the Lord, it appears. You belong to your own desires. You got to link that back to the selfishness of the people who wanted to be the leaders, who wanted to have the power, and who wanted to dictate what this new movement was going to be about in their city. And therefore they would get the name of a leader and say, we represent him. And Paul says, no, you don't. You should represent God. If you're not representing God, then you've missed the whole point. And anyway, he says in this, you say you represent Apollos and you represent me, and therefore you're fighting with one another. Apollos and I work together. Yeah, we share a desk. we're in this thing together. We came to you as a twosome. What is your problem? The problem was not probably that they were all that excited about Apollos, Peter, or Paul. They were excited about themselves. And we'll get to this in a few minutes, they were men, which explains part of it. And how do we know they were men? Because Paul establishes in Corinth that women cannot have leadership in the church. He doesn't do that Rome, Philippi, but he does it in Corinth because a lot of people were being converted from the temple of Aphrodite. And in the temple of Aphrodite, women were the priestesses and men could not speak in church. Women taught, women led, women made all the decisions. Paul gets to Corinth, and we get these passages about a woman must have her head covered. She cannot speak. She has questions, go home and ask her husband. That's because Paul is saying we are doing something so profoundly different that you can't bring a single practice from Aphrodite here. Not one. We're the absolute total opposite. So that lets us know that the people who were saying, well, I represent Apollos, I represent Cephas, I represent Paul, were the men. To give them a little bit of a break in church terms, this would have been the first time for them, at least, that they'd ever had a chance to be in charge of anything when they came from Aphrodite. Not if they came from a Roman temple, not if they came from Jewish synagogue, but those who came from Temple of Aphrodite, they were learning to fly while they built the plane, and so Paul calls them out about this lust for power, when he says your only lust should be to represent Jesus Christ and to tell his story and to make that story come alive in your witness in your community. Okay, so divisions. That'll show back up, but that's one of the problems. So when you go home and read the first 4 chapters, think about that. They're quarreling with one another. They haven't been in business but a year, and they've already started power struggles and conflicts. And, thank God none of that happens in churches anymore. Which is really one of the things, Paige and I talk about this, that we love about this church. All of you belong somewhere else, And somewhere else, probably, like every church, has well-intentioned people on a variety of sides of issues, and you do get stress, and you do get conflict, and it is exhausting. And when you come to Blowing Rock, I think you want to leave that wherever you came from. And we talk about how utterly refreshing it is to be a part of a church where I, at least, haven't seen anybody wrestling for power or, my way or the highway or any of that. And I praise you for that. Paul would have praised you for that. That's what he was saying the church is supposed to be like. And we'll get to that in a few minutes, too, over in chapter 12, where he gives a good description. Okay, next problem, we move over to chapter 5, 6, and 7. Is the problem of sex. And he just jumps right in with the first verse. Everyone is talking about the terrible thing that has happened there among you. Now hear that. Hear that. He's not saying all of you folks are talking about the problem. In fact, he goes on and chastises them because they're not bothered by it. He is saying, all throughout this new movement, in all these places, Thessalonica and Colossae and Philippi and Ephesus and all these Christians, they're saying, have you heard what's going on in Corinth? So this should be an embarrassing thing for him to say to them, everybody's talking about you. And here's why. The terrible thing that's happened there among you, something so evil that even the heathen don't do it. That could have been hyperbole, but you have a man in your church who is living in sin with his father's wife. So you got there adultery and incest, all in one fell swoop. And that, it's pretty serious business. I mean, in all likelihood, this man was either a leader in or somehow closely related to a leader of the church. And Paul apparently has some reason to think that that may be why they haven't dealt with it. And you got a couple, build little bridges between one section and the other. Paul is all over them for 4 chapters about power plays and power hunger and hunger for influence. And then immediately says, and oh, by the way, this sexuality thing, this incest, adultery thing that everybody knows about and you're doing nothing about, build that little bridge. The segue probably means because it's immediate. He doesn't ease into it. That this is related to somebody who is seeking or is exercising power in the church and is a cause of conflict. So he's probably calling somebody out twice here. And he gets real tough about it. Are you so conceited? And that would go either to Gnostics or super apostles. So spiritual, quotation marks. Why aren't you mourning in sorrow and shame and seeing to it that this man is removed from your membership? There's an interesting thought. There are Roman Catholic Church, for example, will excommunicate. There are churches that will, what do they call it, defellowship people for a variety of reasons. Paul's suggesting that, and there's probably no way to soften that. There are biblical passages here and there that say calling people out at times brings them to repentance and thus restores their soul. So, I would like to think Paul has that in mind. I kind of think Paul is still fighting the battle with leadership people, and he's saying, yeah, you're saying that because Paul says here, I'm not rich, I'm not handsome, I don't speak with eloquence, and therefore you don't think I should be the leader. However, some of you who are leading are doing some other things like sleeping with your stepmother. So I'm not sure at this point that Paul is doing the soft redemptive movement. I think he's calling them out. I mean, we're in a battle here between Paul and Paul's opponents. So he gets into this, and he begins to go. And let's talk about why this is important. Obviously, sexual morals are important. We all know that. Obviously, humans are humans and sometimes make decisions that you can't undo and you learn from and grow from. We believe in the grace of Jesus. But in this moment, in Corinth, there's more at stake. And so let me explain this as best I can. As I said, people are being brought into a new movement. It's not like they've had 2,000 years to get used to Christianity and to figure out, this is kind of what it's about. This is pretty much what it teaches. Here are the tenets. This is new to them. Here are people, a lot of them, who have grown up in the temple of Aphrodite. That's what church means to them. That's their only understanding. Now, if you go to First Lutheran, wherever that is, and you decide, I'm going to become a Presbyterian instead in that same city, you'll go from First Lutheran to First Presbyterian, and the form and liturgy may change a little, but you're going to carry all your understanding of church with you from Lutheran to Presbyterian. And if you move from Presbyterian to Baptist and Baptist to Methodist, basically you're going to carry with you, here's what I understand church is. And their uniforms are a little different, and their songs might be, but this is what church is. It's natural, people who had never been in any worshiping community except the temple of Aphrodite, when they go to a new worshiping community, they're going to say, okay, we're still going to do church. It's just that rather than worshiping Aphrodite, we're going to be worshiping God through this guy, Jesus, that Paul's told us about, who's a Messiah, and we're going to figure out more. But we're still doing church, so we'll bring our practices. Well, their practices, as I said, were men can't talk, women are the priest and priestesses, and they practice temple prostitution as a rite and ritual. When the men were required to do that, not that probably all of them said, oh, please, I'd rather not, but when they were required to do that, it meant that we will have the blessings of Aphrodite on our crops and upon our families. we'll have more children, we'll have a successful farm year or a successful vineyard year or whatever. We're going to have a successful year as merchants with our sea vessels or whatever it happened to be. So we worship Aphrodite. Aphrodite is the goddess of sexuality. We worship Aphrodite in a way appropriate to that God. Aphrodite will bless us. Now we're going to a new church that's called Christian instead of Aphrodite, but we're still going to do church, right? So Paul says, no, we're not. We're going to do something so totally different you won't recognize it. So men talk, women don't talk, men are ministers, women aren't. But what he's getting at is we're establishing an entirely new community. And these old practices don't come over, but apparently some of them had. Another reason that would have been a key thing in the Greek churches is that Greeks, and you know this, you've studied philosophy, Greeks believed in a dichotomy between body and soul. And we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 15 in just a couple minutes. But the Greeks believed that the soul has to be in communion with the Creator. And the body is just a container. The body is just something that houses the soul. And as long as your soul is thinking about and reaching out toward and wrestling with truth, and therefore and somehow connected to God, it doesn't matter what you do with your body. Your body it's going to die. It's going to be over. Just eat, drink, be merry, have a good old time. It's the soul that matters. And Paul says, no. Paul's argument to them is A, we're not going to do what we did in that temple, and B, your body does matter because it's going to be resurrected. And again, chapter 15, he goes into that, but he goes into it in these chapters as well. Your body will be raised. Therefore, your body and your soul are not disconnected. There's this body-soul dichotomy. We don't believe that anymore. Where your body goes, your soul goes with it. You and I know that. I mean, you and I know that if you are physically sick or physically, utterly, totally fatigued, you feel spiritually weaker. You know? You just do. Where our bodies go, our souls go with them. And Paul says that's the way it is. So that's part of this. That's fundamentally at the root of this whole 3-chapter thing on sexuality. It's not lurid. It's not. Paul's not all titillating about this. Paul simply says this is part of discipleship. Either you live right physically or you don't. And whatever you do physically reflects who you are spiritually and whose you are. Now, in the midst of this, let me read 6, over in 6, and refer to something I just mentioned, beginning with verse 14. And God both raised the Lord to life and will also raise us up by his power. Do you not see and know that your bodies are members of Christ the Messiah? Am I therefore to take the parts of Christ and make them parts of a prostitute? Never, never. Temple prostitution. Literally part of the ministerial team in the temple of Aphrodite were prostitutes. This is a freebie. You don't even have to do anything with it, but I'll let you know. When the annual giving in the temple was not sufficient, these particular priestesses would go into the city of Corinth near the ports and carry out their stewardship campaign. And bring the money back to the temple. Paul his head almost exploded about that. Do you not know and realize that when a man joins himself to a prostitute, he becomes one body with her? The two, it is written, shall become one flesh. But the person who is united to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Shun immorality and all sexual looseness. Flee from that impurity and any other sin. He talks about outside the body. You know that your body is the temple, the very sanctuary of the Holy Spirit who lives within you, whom you have received from God. You're not your own. You're bought for a price, purchased with, and so he goes on, and talks also about, the union of body and soul. And if you dishonor the one, you have dishonored the other. Okay. He also says in chapter 7, I'll just let you read that one. He talks about marriage. He's not a fan. He says, I prefer that you don't marry. And he talks about divorce, and if you're married to a non-believer, you need to stay with them and not divorce, because maybe you can win them. But if this spouse of yours who is a non-believer says, I'm not happy in the marriage, that you basically should say, there's the door. Don't work it. So he's not, but he's not even happy about marriage at all. He basically says, I would prefer you are like I am. However, if some people, he says, have to be married. So if you're one of those people, go ahead, but just make sure you do it the right way and spiritually. Anyway, you can read chapter 7. There are those who think that Paul probably had a bad marriage. He never refers to that, and so I wouldn't say that. But there is strong opinion among some that he was a member of the Sanhedrin at one point. And if you remember the Sanhedrin, you had to be a married Jewish male. So if that were the case, then that's another whole can of worms where later on Paul would be saying, oh my God, marriage, please, don't do it. Which is pretty much how this comes across chapter 7. However, Paige, I don't agree with that at all. There are places where I read literally and places where I'm not so sure, and just needed to be said. Okay, chapters 8 to 10. Intriguing. It's about, I've got all these things to read to you, but we got 12 minutes. I remember doing this last year. The big issue here is what is clean and what is not. Some of the people who were really, really trying, we get the feeling sometimes you read 1 Corinthians that all of them were just horrible. They really weren't. They were probably, like most places, mostly good folks. But the ones who were not quite so good stirred the mix and got the attention and caused Paul to say, hey, let's fix this. But a lot of these people, they were new and they wanted to do what's right. And they would go into homes where meals had been fixed, sometimes into worship, because they ate together at night in homes before they worshiped. And they would realize that the meat was from animals that had been sacrificed in Greek or Roman temples to false gods. And so they were saying, I can't eat this, but I see other people in our church chowing down, and I think they are therefore worshiping or joining themselves to false gods. And Paul even says in this section that it's as if they have given themselves to demons, that they've opened the door to demons. And this is a big deal because these people are saying, we're in church with you. And yet we come into your home and you offer us meat that's offered to idols, and we're not going to open ourselves up to demons, and yet you're leaders of the church, and what's going on and what are we doing? So Paul basically writes and he says, let's be logical. First of all, a false god is a false god, meaning it's not a god. It's a piece of stone, it's a piece of wood. He uses that language. So if something is sacrificed to it, it's sacrificed to nothing. A piece of wood or stone that's not a god cannot receive a sacrifice that's godly. So Paul says, if you have no problem with it, eat up, because it hasn't been sacrificed to anything. And those who did the sacrificing in other temples, who practice other faiths, and then the priest would take the meat to the market and sell it for money for the temple. That's their problem. You know who God is. You know who Jesus is. You know that there's no false God. You know that this is just meat. Enjoy. But, Paul says, and you'll read this if you read the book, the letter. Paul says some of your brothers and sisters who come into the homes haven't reached the point of figuring that out yet. And they're disturbed. They haven't made that next step theologically to say, this was sacrificed to nothing, and it was sacrificed by somebody not in our community, and it's just meat. To them, it still symbolizes a step away from Jesus toward false gods or even demons. So Paul said, be sensitive. If somebody is upset or ill at ease about eating that meat, just don't eat it. He says, eat it in the privacy of your own home if you wish. But be sensitive to wherever someone else is on the spiritual journey so that you don't offend them when they're trying to make the journey the best they can. You know? Which is good advice. I think there's something profoundly loving about being sensitive to people, who they are, where they are. Sometimes you and I meet folks who are newer in the faith or who haven't lived as long to have the same kind of experiences or who haven't made as much of the journey. And Paul would basically say, you know, be patient with them, be mentoring to them, be loving toward them, take into account who they are and where they are, and you're on the same train just in different cars, you know, be loving. Which for Paul, ultimately, says to the Corinthians, that's the whole key anyway. You serve Jesus and you love one another. And if you can do that, so that's what he says about the food is you just, and it takes 3 chapters to deal with it because it was a serious issue. Be sensitive to the needs of other people. And you know, he basically says, if you really want that stuff, eat it on your own in your own house. If you can do without it, do without it. So I think we could take that lesson and apply it in a lot of different ways to our relationship with other people of faith and our sensitivity. Chapters 11 to 14. Now this is interesting. It's the gathering, which means how they worship. And there's no way that we're going to be able to then get to the resurrection. So I'm going to use my Mark Depp voice to the best I can. They gathered in people's homes to worship. They had dinner in one another's homes. They had dinner in remembrance of Jesus. So it wasn't just dinner. It was sort of the prelude to our communion. They remembered Jesus while they ate. So Paul talks to them here in chapter 11, verses 20 to 28. And he says, he does it again. He says, word has leaked out that, you know. So it was, to this point, he's really embarrassing these people. Everybody's talking about what you Corinthians are like. And here's one of the things, that when you join in one another's homes for worship, some of you get there early and you eat all the food. And others come in late and they're hungry at the end of a work day and there's no food left. Maybe half a bowl of rice or a scrap of bread, but you ate all the food. And you drank all the wine. And around the table you can't eat and drink in remembrance of Jesus when there's nothing left to eat or drink. You ate all the food. You drank all the wine. Then he says, and furthermore, you drank enough wine that some of you are pretty tipsy before you get to the worship part. So what they did, they would eat together. The format for worship, you'd eat together, and then you would pray together. You would sing psalms, and then they would tell Jesus stories. That's what worship was. But he says, you don't eat together. Your own needs are first. Carry that right back to the first section. They're arguing about power, about me, my way, my wants, my wishes, my dreams, my desires, my influence, my power. It's all about me. And you're carrying that right in your face. Sexuality, yeah, that's what I want. Who cares about the body as long as my soul's good? You know, now food. We gather, we eat, we drink. Somebody else hungry or thirsty? Too bad. Now let's worship. Paul says you can't worship like that. You've already diffused worship before you get to the prayers, the songs, and the Jesus stories by your complete lack of concern for one another and your complete concentration of concern on your own needs and your own self. So he talks to them about what we would call communion. He talks to them about tongues over in chapter 14, 1 through 19. Not going to read it to you. It's too long to read. But Paul does not in any way condemn the use of prayer language. He indeed says he practices that privately. But he does say in the fellowship for worship, those who were using prayer language were confusing those who didn't possess it and were demonstrating a gift from God that others didn't have that made them superior. Going back again to Gnostics and super apostles. So he says, you're using something maybe not so much for prayer as to show that you are closer to God than the rest of the group in the room, and therefore you deserve influence, power, and authority that they don't have. See, got to read a text in context. And we have to link, you start reading a book, you don't just leave chapter 1 behind when you get to chapter 5, because there's these strands that go through. And some stuff we think I'm reading about this, but it is also connected to that. And this definitely is. So Paul does not put down spiritual gifts, but he goes on to say there are a whole bunch of them. One's as valid as another. And in a service of worship, he says, it's better to speak a word that's understood than 1,000 that aren't. So he tells them, if this prayer language, if you're sincere about it, do it in private. Who does that sound like? Sound like Jesus. Do your praying in a closet where only God sees, rather than on a street corner where your prayers make you seem so important and so knowledgeable and so Gnostic, So Paul is saying that too. If you're using your prayer life as a badge of honor, it's not. Oh, interesting. But then he talks about what the church is at its best. And I do want to... I can't. We don't have time. He talks about the body. He says, this is who you are. If the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I'm not part of the body, is it any less part of the body? If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand and not part of the body, is it any less a part of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where would be the hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? Every single thing is vital. Every single person is vital. Every single gift is vital. And then he says to these people who are, kind of into the whole sexuality theme anyway, our more modest parts receive greater honor by the way we garb and dress ourselves. So those that would have been put down by those who desired power and authority, Paul said, they may deserve more honor than you do. But basically, we're all part of a body where we depend upon one another. And he has this wonderful phrase, when one member rejoices, we all celebrate. When one member weeps, we all cry together. So he's saying to them, factions destroy the body. You don't have part of a body on this street and part of a body on the next and call it a body. We all blend together for the same purpose. And that, he says, is what a church looks like. Okay, real quickly, chapter 15 on the resurrection. Some of them had begun to say the teaching of Jesus are important, the lifestyle of Jesus is important, but we don't think the resurrection's that big a deal. And they were talking about bodily resurrection. Because Greeks especially believed that the soul is immortal. Eternal means, immortal means the soul always was and always will be. Eternal means you're created and then you always will be. And they believe their soul has always been around, it will always be around, but the body is not going to be. And Paul argues in the 15th chapter about the resurrection of the body, which, again, linking all the sections together, you can see how it applies. So he says those who are saying, we're not sure there was a resurrection. He talks about the witness of Numbers. That's 15 verses 1 to 9. He starts saying, Jesus appeared to the disciples. Jesus appeared to people here. Jesus appeared to people there. And then he says, I can trot out 500 people who saw him. That's pretty impressive. I mean, that'd stand up in a court of law, I think. If you bring 500 witnesses that say, yeah, I saw this happen, most attorneys, Ben, wouldn't you feel pretty good having that on your side? Yeah, 500 witnesses saying, yeah, I saw it. So Paul says to them, if you're doubting this resurrection thing, how many of them you want to talk to? I'll start bringing them through. And then he says, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also unto me. So he challenges them, do you believe me or not? If you believe me, that should be the only thing. I wouldn't have to bring the 500. I saw him, which would have been on the road to Damascus. So he says that the bodily resurrection is important. Jesus lived in a recognizable fashion. Meaning not some spirit that you don't know what it is, but a recognizable fashion that looked the same way he looked prior to death. Which I got to tell you, for me, is not encouraging. I want to look different. Anyway, then verses 12 to 19, he talks about how imperative it is. This is where he says, if Christ is not raised, then we are, of all people, most to be pitied. He even says we're fools. Don't believe any of the rest of it, is what he's saying to them, because they're saying, a lot of this makes sense. We don't believe the resurrection part, but he's saying, look, without resurrection, don't pay attention to anything else I've said, or Paul says, or Peter says, or anybody else says. If there's no resurrection, throw it out the window. Go back to Aphrodite, or go back wherever you're going to go. It all hinges on this, he says. That's 15, 12 to 19. Then 42 to 50, he talks about eternal bodies, which is like, he uses the analogy of a seed that's planted, a seed of corn, but then it comes up a full ear, and they aren't the same, but each has a body. And he says, we do not know how it shall appear, and yet we do believe that it's not going to be some disconnected spirit. We will have a bodily resurrection, very important to him, because if you cannot make sacred the idea of body, then these people that bring all this stuff over from Aphrodite will say, see, eat, drink, and be merry. Resurrection of the body, key. He says without that, if he were not bodily raised, we're to be pitied. And then verses 15, 51, 52. Let me read that real quickly. And we're late, and I apologize, but you knew this would happen. But 51 and 52, he says, I'm telling you this strange and wonderful secret. We shall not all die, but we shall all be given new bodies. It will happen in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, when the last trumpet is blown, for there will be a trumpet blast in the sky, and all the Christians who have died will suddenly become alive with new bodies that will never, ever die. And then we who are still alive shall suddenly have new bodies too. Two things there. One is, as I said, Paul believed in what's called parousia. He believed in the imminence of the second coming. It's going to happen any time. And even talks about those of us anticipating he'd be part of it. Those of us who are still alive at that point will receive our new bodies at the time of the second coming, and all the dead in Christ shall rise. That's called general resurrection. The theology that when you die, you're buried, you wait till the second coming, and everybody's raised at the same time. General resurrection. A peek at 2 weeks down the road or even 3. When he writes to the Philippians, he's rethought that. And he says, it would be better for me now to die and be with Christ. Well, you can't die and be with Christ now if you're going to wait for the second coming. Something happens. Is one wrong, the other right? No, remember what we said. You got to put the development of the man, the development of his faith, and the context in which he writes into focus. And we'll talk about that in a couple more weeks. But here, early in his ministry, thinking he's not going to die, he says, general resurrection. All right, the bottom line then, and I'm not going to, certainly this is one I don't have to read to you, but the bottom line for Paul, the bottom lines really, are 2 things. First of all, that the church in Corinth, and we can take that, remember I said you look at the particular and say, what's the general? So the church in Corinth, he says, and you and I can say, and yeah, that applies to any church, should. Church in Corinth should be a body rather than a battlefield. It should not be a contest for leadership based on ego needs, but it should be this fluid unit of what? Of love. 1 Corinthians 13. And that's the key chapter where he says what makes a church operate in the way it should, which is not how you Corinthians are operating at all. Because we read this at weddings and it's really warm and sweet. And oh my gosh, this is so nice. But where it's placed in Corinthians, it's almost to say, okay, here's what it's supposed to be look like, as opposed to what I've been describing for 12 chapters. You know, here's what a real church does. Here's what real Christians do, but you're babies. You look like you don't even belong to the Lord. And then he describes love. And if we read nothing but verses 4 to 8, you've read what he says, the patient and kind and building one another up and not celebrating evil but celebrating good and never failing. And this is what we're supposed to be like when we follow Jesus. Ultimately, we're supposed to be people who love. There's a book, a new book by Barbara Brown Taylor. She's just so smart. And her book's called Holy Envy. And she talks about all kind of different faith journeys and her own devotion to Christianity. And at the end, she pretty much says, the one single spiritual principle that can never be denied and can never be replaced and can never be surpassed is love. And Paul says that to Corinthians, that unless you're at a point where you can do that, you're not a church yet. And when you do anything that diminishes that diminishes the unity of the body or the presence of love, then you are something. You're some sort of a group or an organization, but you're not a church, says Paul. So that's 1 Corinthians, and if we can hear it from the standpoint as if we were members of that community, you can hear how offensive it was to them. I mean, he just starts out saying, he starts out the very first few verses, look how God has blessed you, and isn't it wonderful the blessings God pours out and the blessings you can yet anticipate. So it starts out kind of really nice, and then a few verses in he says, and look what you're doing about it. And he doesn't slow down for the rest of 1 Corinthians. So next week we're going to take a look at 2 Corinthians, which isn't as long, so we won't be here as long, probably I say now. But it's called the Conciliatory Letter, and it is probably the third letter that Paul wrote. It should be 3 Corinthians, except we don't have 2nd, but we have little references to it in 2nd. But it's a conciliatory letter. It's what happens when Paul and the people say, let's make up and move forward. And then we'll get to Philippians. And then we'll look at the whole thing. And right now you can get to dinner. Thanks for coming. Thanks for watching. Next Thursday we'll pick up with 2 Corinthians.